Hello and welcome to We Caribbean, a special program in which we discuss and analyze the issues affecting the region, giving a voice to those who are impacted. It's their issues, their concerns, their triumphs on We Caribbean. I'm your host, Doris Folo. This week, we'll be focusing on the recent foiled mercenary attacks against Venezuela, peace in the Caribbean community, and U.S. imperialism as it relates to the region. Joining us are Paul Dobson, Regional Coordinator for the Committee for International Solidarity and the Struggle for Peace in Venezuela's Mérida state, Christophe Thompson, Chairman of the Left Alliance for National Democracy in Jamaica, and Bahman Azad of the U.S. Peace Council. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Christophe, beginning with you, over 40 people have been captured. Many of them have already attended their first hearing after trying to invade Venezuela in order to carry out a coup against President Nicolas Maduro. Among them, 2 U.S. Army veterans. What are your thoughts on these developments?
Well, this is very scary for us in the Caribbean. We have this understanding. War in general is just something very far from us. The last time I think something similar to this would have happened would have been the invasion of Panama to get out Noriega. The idea of a military confrontation taking place is scary for the region. Already with economic warfare, Trinidad and Tobago has a refugee crisis to deal with. And before this particular attack, when the U.S. sent naval fleets to the region, that in itself was particularly scary. If I had to sum it up in one word, what this is, it's pretty scary.
Paul, to you, these captures we've seen over the past 8 days have been attributed to Venezuela's civic military police alliance. Explain to us what that is and why that has been key.
Well, there is one of the elements which the mainstream media often overlook here in Venezuela is the organized people, the conscious organized people in the country. Now, obviously in Venezuela, there is a vast range of different political opinions. Some people support the government, other people oppose the government, some people are critically supportive, others are critically supportive of the opposition. But that said, the vast majority of the communities here are organized, and the vast majority of the communities here are patriotic in that they would oppose any sort of foreign attempt to invade the country, as we saw last week. So the events of the 2 military incursions, or the failed military incursions, have really brought out to the light the role of the civilians in defending the country. One of the boats was actually detected by local fishermen who contacted the local militia, the civilian militia in their town, in their village, who then obviously contacted through the chain of command the rest of the armed forces, who were able to intervene and bring in the muscle to basically halt this attempted incursion. And this is something which is often manipulated, misconstrued a little bit by people who aren't familiar with Venezuela, who consider that the government is only propped up by the military and that the people are to some extent oppressed by the military. And these sort of events really go to counteract this sort of line that we see in the international press.
Bahman, now this failed plot was organized brazenly from the United States. You know, Jordan Goudreau, the founder of the Silver Corps mercenary group, met on various occasions with the Venezuelan opposition in Miami, and we see U.S. government officials meeting quite frequently with Venezuelan opposition members. How is this able to take place so brazenly?
Well, it's not only that. In addition to that, the monies that were promised to these groups were $200 million were promised to be paid through the confiscated properties of Citgo. And that means that the US government is directly involved in that. But the thing is, this attempt to overthrow governments has a long history. But it seems that with sanctions, they were hoping to be able to bring down these governments that they want to. But it didn't work. And with the emergence of this pandemic, they thought that now these governments are on their knees and they can be easily forced to step up, to step down. And it seems that it was an opportunistic effort to see if they can use the pressures of the emergency that all of these governments are under, to use that as an opportunity to agitate something or trigger some process, which again failed, as Paul is described. People are standing by the government.
Definitely using the coronavirus pandemic as a sort of smoke screen. Christoph, my question to you, do you think that this sort of activity that we're seeing by the United States is a continuation of their history of imperialist activities in the region? Because earlier you mentioned Panama, but Panama is not the only country.
Yes, definitely. Panama isn't the only country. It was just the most recent example of something like this, where they send in persons with the specific intention of capturing the president overtly and brazenly. They had also done something that I guess more recently they did something similar with Manuel Zelaya, but they did it in league with the local armed forces. But this is the first time in a while you're actually seeing a direct foreign invasion. But it's not the first time, as you say. It is definitely a continuation of that history of direct intervention, with the intention of, well, taking control of countries' natural resources. For example, in Panama's government wasn't really progressive on Noriega, but he wanted to pull out from that School of the Americas where Latin American military officers were being trained, and they started to follow up with him after that. In Venezuela's case, though, we do believe it's much more about the natural resources, as it has been in other countries. Sometimes it's about the strategic position of them. Sometimes it's about cutting support for other governments. So when they had tried to sabotage Jamaica, it was because Jamaica was forming ties with Cuba. And that's another thing that they're looking at now. They're looking at Venezuela as one thing that is supporting Cuba, and they're building up this whole conspiracy of this conspiracy theory of the Venezuelan government being some puppet government of Cuba, and Cuba is just using it to steal natural resources. And you see Venezuelan opposition persons saying things like that as well. I think this is just a general attack on the region itself. I think it's an aim to control the region. Now that they see a country that is properly sovereign and is able to maintain sovereignty in a particular way and can strengthen other countries to do the same, because Venezuela did respond when the US sabotaged Antigua and Barbuda's efforts to address the COVID-19 crisis, for example. When they see a country that is able to stand strong, independent of them, and helping other countries to do the same, that's not something they like, and they're aiming to crush that. So I do think it is a part of that history of trying to get out any government that stands for self-determination, that stands for self-reliance, that expresses regional solidarity with other countries to prevent them from being dependent on the US.
Now, Paul, based on what Chris just said, he's speaking about the United States trying to basically control the Caribbean region. And a big part of that is the press. And we've seen the corporate press try to sugarcoat or water down these events. We've seen news headlines which make these coup attempts seem as though it was just a simple boat trying to make its way into Venezuela. You being a journalist yourself, what do you think about these reports and the way Venezuela is featured by international media?
Well, the complicity between the mainstream corporate press and the imperialist governments is nothing new, Darius. It's something which anyone who has studied a little bit of US imperialism will inevitably stumble across. What we're seeing now is like you say, how they're attempting to water this down to defame the events which not only have been denounced by the Caracas government, but have been verified by anti-government sources in Miami, by the private sector, mercenary firm Silvercorp, even by Guaido's own team members who have verified the version of events which we have heard coming out of the Caracas government. So I think there can be no doubt really about what happened. And for any news outlet to question this based on the extensive evidence which we've seen is clearly a political attempt to manipulate and defame what is basically an anti-imperialist government in Caracas. No, a lot has been written, a lot has been analyzed about how the US treats the Caribbean, Latin American as a whole, but especially the Caribbean, as its backyard. But this is a perfect example in contemporary history where we can see that they do basically what they want to do. The Caribbean and Latin America declared itself as a zone of peace in 2014. Regardless of this, the United States has decided to try to spark a war here, completely disrespecting the views of all of the nations which make up the region and treating them basically like they're states of the United States themselves.
And Barman, threats against Venezuela's sovereignty continue in the form of sanctions. What does the U.S. Peace Council say about these unilateral coercive measures?
Well, we have been fighting against the sanctions from the very beginning, actually. We have put together a long time ago a coalition in support of what was happening with Syria in terms of opposing U.S. interventions there and the sanctions there. We have been dealing with sanctions everywhere, but at the same time, we have been trying to bring all anti-imperialist peace organizations in the United States together as one coalition. U.S. is ignoring United Nations calls. We have issued a open letter, which is on the Peace Council's website, uspeacecouncil.org, that is sponsored by dozens of organizations from the Sanctions Guild. And it calls on the President of the United States and the Secretary General of the United Nations to put an end to all sanctions, ask the United States to stop all military actions, ask the U.S. to drop all those false charges against President Maduro and officials of Venezuelan government for drug trafficking, demands that the U.S. warships be removed from the shores of Venezuela. And this has been signed already by over 8,250 people. And we are still collecting signatures. We are hoping from people from all over the world will sign it. Actually, we have close to 4,000 of those signatures from around the world.
Barman, and with that, we head to our first break. But first, a celebration by the Chihuahua fishing community who captured those mercenaries, 8 mercenaries 1 week ago today. We'll pick up where we left off with Barman, Chris, and Paul when we return.
En Venezuela, mandamos nosotros la revolución, los negros arrechos, vete, 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 Nicolás, Maduro, Diosdado, Marcos Torres, Johanna Sánchez, aquí es un pueblo que va a luchar por ustedes, los queremos, mano, ¡que viva Chihuahua!
Welcome back. As we continue to discuss the failed mercenary incursion in Venezuela, the residents of the fishing community who actually led to the capture of the group of 8 terrorists, including the U.S. Silver Corps mercenaries, say that they should not be underestimated. Here's what they told our correspondent, Madeline Garcia.
They never thought a fisherman could also be part of the militia. Farm workers are part of the militia. So are teachers, policemen. We are all part of the Bolivarian militia. As a people, we are always at the ready. They underestimated us, thinking less of us. They didn't see us coming as an organized people. They think they are John Rambo and we are simple workers, but we will always triumph. We know how to fish, how to work. We have people who work in the cacao plantation and others who fish. We are not used to violence. This is not how you get rid of a government. If you want Maduro out, you need to take part in the electoral process. This is not the way.
Oye, Donald Trump, en Venezuela, mandamos nosotros.
Fisher folk from the Chuao community in Venezuela. Paul, you are based in Merida. What is your reaction to these fisher folk saying that they hold their country's sovereignty at very high regards and that they will do what they can to defend their country?
Well, certainly there is. International law defends and allows for people to determine their own path and express self-determination. This is something which definitely supersedes any sort of opinions which, as the fisherman commented in the video, which they may have about the current government in Venezuela or not. The right to sovereignty of a nation is something which is laid out in stone internationally. So when we see the United States, be it through their government and their public armed forces, or in this case, through a private mercenary firm, with or without the green lighting of the State Department, when we see the United States violate a people's right to sovereignty, we're seeing them violate international law. And this is something which has to be denounced across the world. Any sort of escalation of an armed conflict in Venezuela's northern coastline or any part of Latin America will be paid for by the people. The people will be those who lose their lives, the people of the Caribbean, the people of Venezuela. And this is something which obviously supersedes and ignores any sort of political alliances or political opinions. So war is something which really affects us all. And for any government to condone what was happening in the Chuao military incursion is basically an acceptance that the United States is able to trample on another nation's sovereignty.
Baman, speaking of countries condoning what is taking place in Venezuela, now the Caribbean community has really stood up in defense of Venezuela's sovereignty. However, there are some nations which have had a difference in opinion, including Jamaica, for example, the Bahamas and Haiti. Do you think that this type of discourse or disagreement within the Caribbean community is really a threat to its unity?
Well, I don't generally think so, because many of these governments, with their positions, are results of pressures they are receiving from the United States. I don't think the majority of people in those countries are behind such actions. So I don't think it is a danger, but it requires an alertness. It requires mass mobilization from bottom up, as Venezuelan case has shown, and I'm not surprised that the fishermen defended their country so heroically like this. But this is not new. From the beginning, you remember the 2002 coup against the President Chavez. It was the people who returned him again, right? So it is the people of Latin America who have been so far upholding the principles that we are talking about. And they will be, I'm sure of that. But I'm also sure that the US is not going to give up, which clearly shows that the US needs to suppress in order to control the resources and everything else. And in this situation, it seems that Venezuela is a key element, not only because of its left orientation, socialist orientation like Cuba, but also because it's sitting on top of resources that can be mobilized, can be used to mobilize huge resistance in Latin America, as they were doing it before all these problems. So the sanctions are not just a financial issue for Venezuela, but they are blocking any support for the rest of the Latin American countries and Caribbean countries.
One major thing that the Caribbean has had historically, which we're complaining about now internally, unity on foreign policy has prevented us from being used. Right now, with us being split, when there are votes in the OAS, for example, certain things have been able to pass because some Caribbean nations have broken the collective line. It's certain Caribbean countries that have stuck together and held a certain line against intervention that have prevented certain things from passing by like a supermajority. But certain things have been passed because of the collaboration of some governments from the Caribbean, including a resolution endorsing sanctions against Venezuela, which is one thing I'm very upset with my own government about. They endorse sanctions against Venezuela through an OAS resolution, so they're giving legitimacy to this and to what the government of the U.S. is doing to the government of Venezuela, which directly impacts Cuba as well. One recent thing that happened as well sometime last year was the so-called Caribbean Leaders Summit, which was only specific Caribbean countries involved. And then when Mike Pompeo visited Jamaica recently, it was supposed to be a Caribbean meeting, he claimed, but only Caribbean leaders of specific countries were invited. And other major players within CARICOM complained about that. So it is something that is already somewhat seen as dividing the region, according to even some of the region's leaders who side with Venezuela, including Maya Motley from Barbados and Keith Rowley from Trinidad and Tobago, Ralph Gonzalez from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So I do think there is a threat with or a division that the U.S. is taking advantage of.
Yes, so speaking about this sort of division, I'm going to throw this question to Paul. In Trinidad and Tobago, which is Venezuela's closest neighbor, well, at least it's Trinidad. Venezuela is Trinidad and Tobago's closest neighbor. What we've seen coming out of the country from Friday was that the opposition raised certain concerns that oil was sold to Aruba from Trinidad and Tobago, and that it allegedly reached to Venezuela, and that was a breach of U.S. sanctions. The opposition has since called on the U.S. to investigate these allegations. And basically, Trinidad and Tobago's Prime Minister called the opposition leader a traitor and said not only did the country not break or breach U.S. sanctions, but that the U.S. executive orders, presidential executive orders, aren't international law. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the first point we have to make very clearly is that the U.S. unilateral coercive measures, commonly called the sanctions, are illegal. These have not been backed by the United Nations. These do not form any part of international law. And so any country, any other government in the region, any Caribbean government which changes its behavior, its policies to adhere to these sanctions or not, is doing so basically out of a threat of secondary sanctions. So they're doing so because they're threatened, out of fear. There is no international law which compels them to adhere to these unilateral measures which the Washington government has announced. But the threat of secondary sanctions against Trinidadian businesses in the United States or Trinidadian bank accounts in the United States, which could all be seized under these measures, is immense. And this is the way in which the imperialist government of the White House works. They don't necessarily have to go through international law, but they're able to act like a mafia boss and bully other nations into doing what they want to do. And this is essentially what we're seeing is happening. No? Obviously, the larger and more powerful, economically powerful nations are able to stand up to these sort of sanctions, these unilateral measures, as is the case of Russia, who have bypassed some of these sanctions by transferring Rosneft oil corporations into government holding firms. And the Chinese CNPC, which has basically said that they're going to continue operating in Venezuela with regardless of the threat of sanctions. But for the smaller countries, which are dependent on U.S. investments, which have much greater access and have a greater threats because of their commercial interchange with the United States, the threat of secondary sanctions is very, very heavy against them. And this is obviously a great incentive for them to try and change their policy line and not basically annoy their northern partner. I just wanted to pick up while we're talking on the issue of the unilateral coercive measures. I wanted to pick up, Darius, on something which Barman commented earlier. It's very important for everyone watching this program to remember that we can't separate this attempted military incursion in Venezuela from the unilateral coercive measures. They go hand in hand. Why do they go hand in hand? Because the money which was going to be used to pay this private mercenary firm came from confiscated public Venezuelan goods in the United States.
What is happening now is that the opposition in Trinidad is trying to blow up a particular issue and call the USA's attention to it. So it's not even as if the US is putting pressure on Trinidad and Tobago as is. The opposition went to the US embassy and delivered a letter basically calling and inviting the US to investigate whether the Trinidadian government is being submissive enough to the US or not. And when the opposition does that, it's very dangerous. You would know, being in Venezuela, when the opposition is inviting a country to do things which can call sanctions on itself, is dangerous. So that is also the talk within Trinidad. A lot of persons are accusing the opposition of welcoming US sanctions on Trinidad and Tobago itself, because they have that same understanding that secondary sanctions are what would apply if the outcome of these US investigations go in a certain way. And also we have to look at the fact that there's an upcoming election in Trinidad and Tobago. And some persons believe that the UNC is trying to get the US to favor them over the PNM, and that can work in their favor in some way. So we need to look closely at what's happening in Trinidad with the election, considering some shady things happened with the election in Guyana recently. Yeah. Because if Trinidad's foreign policy is supposed to change, that really shifts the balance. Historically, the major players in Caribbean foreign policy have been Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and Barbados.
Yeah, definitely. And we do have 17,000 Venezuelans in Trinidad and Tobago temporarily at this point in time. Unfortunately, guys, we've reached the end of this week's We Caribbean on the field mercenary incursion in Venezuela that led to the arrest of more than 40 people. We would like to thank our guest today, Paul Dobson, Regional Coordinator for the Committee for International Solidarity and the Struggle for Peace in Venezuela's Merida State, Christophe Thompson, Chairman of the Left Alliance for National Democracy in Jamaica, and Bahman Azad of the U.S. Peace Council. Thank you so much for joining us. See you next week.